A massive hack just hit crypto this weekend. It involves Aave, Kelp, LayerZero. This could leave Aave with somewhere between $200 and $300 million in bad debt. I'm going to break all of that down for you, the impact, the causes, and whether North Korea might be involved again. We're also going to talk about what comes next because I do have thoughts on what could happen from here. We'll compare the situation with other lending protocols. I've got a lot to say. This is a special hack video. So what exactly happened? It started this weekend with Kelp. Kelp is a restaking project on Ethereum. It launched during the whole restaking wave, with EtherFi, Renzo. Kelp has a token called rsETH, which represents staked Ether, which is a Kelp staked Ether. There's a lot of it out there. And on April 18th, an attacker managed to mint, basically to create out of thin air, a huge amount of rsETH token. We're talking about more than 100,000 token here, which represents close to $300 million, or roughly 18% of the entire supply of rsETH token. So suddenly the attacker was sitting on this enormous amount of tokens, close to $300 million, but they couldn't just dump all of it on the market because there wasn't enough liquidity. So what did they do instead? Well, they went straight to Aave. Aave, the lending and borrowing protocol where you can deposit crypto and borrow other crypto against it. The attacker deposited these tokens, these minted tokens, these hacked tokens, these rsETH tokens. He deposited this token on Aave, and then they borrowed WETH, which is real Ether. So they borrowed this against the tokens that he minted. So in the end, the hacker deposited Ether they had created out of thin air and used that to borrow actual ETH. And after that, they took the ETH and moved into the laundering phase, so on their own wallet. But honestly, once the money leaves Aave, that part is less important for what I wanted to focus on here. What really matters is that the hacker managed to turn fake tokens into real Ether. And that's where the real problem starts. First, the people holding rsETH are obviously in trouble because the overall value of their token has dropped, or at least it should drop. Right now, the smart contracts are frozen, so nothing is really moving anymore with this token. And in theory, if the loss is socialized, we're talking about roughly an 18% haircut. But the biggest problem really is for the people who had funds deposited on Aave. Why? Because Aave is now stuck with bad debt. That means it doesn't have enough collateral left to cover what's been borrowed. So if everyone wants to withdraw their fund, that simply won't be possible because there isn't enough money left in the protocol to cover everything. Now, of course, on Aave's scale, this is not all the tokens that Aave holds. Aave's TVL is still huge. Right now, it's around $17 billion. So yeah, just before the hack, it was above $20 billion, but $26 billion even. So even if it's still massive, it has already dropped by several $billion in just a few days. And the bad debt can't simply be absorbed by Aave itself. They don't really have the means to do that. Their treasury only has around $85 million. They also have a backstop fund called Umbrella. You can find it here, but that safety fund only covers the assets directly involved in the bad debt, and we're mainly talking about Ether. So in that backstop fund, there's only about $55 million worth of WETH. So that's not going to cover the debt either. And even if you add the treasury and the safety fund together, you get around $130 million, and that still doesn't cover the whole. Clearly, there is an issue in Aave with the bad debts. So from here, a lot of things can happen. I found this analysis from the founder of DeFi Llama really interesting. He says that there are basically three things that could happen now. The first option is that the debt, or more precisely, the loss linked to the Kelp hack, gets spread across all Kelp token holders. In other words, everyone takes an 18% haircut. And honestly, I think that's the fairest option in a way, but it will still have a major impact on Aave because if you reduce the value of the token for everyone, and a huge amount of rsETH is deposited on Aave, then that creates a serious problem. There is at least 630,000 rsETH in Aave, and that creates a problem. Like I said, I saw more than 600,000. If you apply that 18% haircut, you end up with losses of around $216 million. And that would mean about more than $200 million in bad debt. The other option, and Aave seems to be pushing for this, and I'm not exactly sure why, although I do have a theory, is to claim that everything is fine on Ethereum. Basically, they're saying the rsETH token on Ethereum do not have an issue, and that only the rsETH token on layer 2s are affected. You can see that here they're saying, based on their analysis, that rsETH token on Ethereum has no problem at all. And honestly, it almost feel like Aave is trying to push the debt onto the L2s in the end. So onto Base, onto Arbitrum, onto Mantle. There's $71 million on Base of rsETH. There's $150 million on Arbitrum. More than $160 million on Mantle. And my impression is that Aave wants to shift the issue onto the L2s because they're probably thinking that on the L2 side, the companies behind those L2s might be able to help to cover the debt. Whereas if the debt is spread across Ethereum, there's nobody who's going to step in and help Aave repay that debt on Ethereum because they're on their own. The Ethereum Foundation is never going to come in and bail them out. So that's my theory, at least. In any case, Aave's position right now is basically to say there is no problem, like I said, with ETH. And if the problem is only on L2s, that would also mean that Aave's insurance system, you know, the one I told you about, the backstop Umbrella, would not be affected. Umbrella is mainly on the Ethereum network, and those funds would not be touched. So anyone who deposited money into Umbrella would not be impacted. And you should know that with Umbrella, anyone can come and deposit money there to earn an attractive yield, but all the money deposited into Umbrella can also be used to cover losses in the event of a hack. And that's exactly what's just happened now. In fact, in the event of bad debt, mostly. So yeah, one option, like I told you, would be to make sure the bad debt is not spread across all our rsT holders. But yeah, honestly, it will be difficult, you know, to push the debt only to L2s. And another option, which looks much more complicated, would be trying to get back to some kind of snapshot from before the hack and so on. But that's going to be more difficult, and there's also another possible solution. Aave could seize the collateral that was hacked and deposited on Aave and redistribute it across other users. But even that is not guaranteed. So yeah, that's really where we are right now. There are multiple possible scenarios and nobody knows exactly what's going to happen, but there's a whole of $300 million. And the question is, who's gonna pay that? And there's gonna be losers in this situation, is for sure. So in the end, yeah, Kelp DAO, Kelp is the one holding the cards when it comes to deciding how that collateral will be distributed across all the Kelp tokens, across all the rsETH tokens. So where if it's going to be only on Ethereum and on L2s, we don't know for now. And apparently the three companies involved, Kelp, LayerZero, and Aave, have lawyers all over this now trying to find solution because this could get very messy. But in the end, who is really responsible for this hack happening? The real issue comes from LayerZero. Why? Because what happened is that Kelp, with its rsETH token, uses LayerZero as its cross-chain interoperability solution. In other words, it uses LayerZero to issue the token on Ethereum, but also on Base, on Arbitrum, and so on, so that you basically have one token existing across multiple blockchains. It's apparently very easy to implement on LayerZero. The problem is that Kelp used one of the LayerZero features badly. Let's say they used LayerZero badly in the sense that they relied on only one validation node, one DVN, whereas LayerZero recommends using multiple validation nodes, one controlled by LayerZero and one controlled by Kelp or by another entity. But Kelp basically said, no, we're only relying on LayerZero's validation node. And LayerZero allowed that. It didn't seem to bother them before. So they were using only one validation node, and that problem is that this validation node, I'll use the technical term if you want, it's the DVN, but it's simple to just say it's node. This node had an issue. That LayerZero validation node approved something it was never supposed to approve. It received a message it was never supposed to receive, and a message from the hacker telling it to mint 100,000 tokens, more especially 116,000 rsETH tokens. And how did that happen? LayerZero published a postmortem explaining what happened, and honestly, it's really scary. They clearly suspect North Korea, and what they say is that LayerZero infrastructure itself was not directly compromised, but the hacker managed to obtain the list of the RPCs being queried to interact with the blockchain. In other words, the list of entities acting as a bridge between the blockchain and LayerZero. You can think of them as a kind of Ethereum validators or intermediary sources providing blockchain data to LayerZero. And the hacker managed to get that list. They do not explain exactly how, but it was probably some kind of breach on the LayerZero side that allowed that list to be exposed. And then after that, the hacker compromised those entities, those two entities that were feeding blockchain data into LayerZero. They infected them with the malicious code and made them send false data back to LayerZero, while at the same time carrying out a denial of service attack by blocking the other servers that LayerZero was using to get blockchain data from. So in the end, LayerZero was left with two malicious sources from which it could receive blockchain data, and those two sources were compromised by the hacker. That's how he was able to send fake messages to mint tokens out of thin air. And LayerZero accepted these messages. So clearly, the problem comes from LayerZero. LayerZero is trying to wash its hands of it by saying, no, it's not our fault. The issue is not at the LayerZero level, it's at the Kelp level. But I think, I think this is going to cause a total loss of confidence in Kelp and also in LayerZero, because LayerZero clearly had a problem. So Kelp is also partly responsible, of course. They didn't follow the best practices, but the hack happened at the LayerZero level. So the responsibility is shared between LayerZero and Kelp. And with Aave, there's also an issue. In the end, Aave accepted this collateral, rsETH. They accepted it after votes and discussion, and they approved it. So yeah, without raising any alarm. And the fact that the token was using only one DVN, one validator, was not something that was discussed. So clearly, there's a problem there too in the governance process of adding new tokens. And I know I have been one of the first criticizing Aave lately, saying that the security level was going to degrade and so on. But the validation to add the rsETH token happened back when the Aave Chain initiative was still there, when BGD Labs was still there, and so on. And Chaos Labs also. So this is not just Aave Labs, the company, doing something stupid now. Not at all. This happened at the time where the best service providers were still involved. So yeah, what that means is, yes, there is either a risk management problem or simply this kind of thing that can happen this is the kind of thing that can happen when you have a model like Aave, where in the end you have shared liquidity between all the markets. And in other words, there is one big common liquidity pool, and when there is a problem with one collateral asset, it can have an impact on other assets. It can create contagion across the rest of the asset deposited on Aave. And that's also something I had already mentioned back when the Resolve hack happened. I told you, luckily Resolve USR was not live on Aave, but it could have been. Because when the Resolve hack happened previously, there were discussions on Aave to add the USR to Aave, and they had approved the launch of the USR on Aave, but in the end, we don't know exactly why the Aave managed to dodge this bullet, and they dodged several other bullets, but this time, they got hit by one. And in reality, and it really, I don't know how to say this, but yeah, it really helps. It really helps you understand the very significant risks that exist in lending and borrowing protocols when you have one shared liquidity layer, like what Aave is doing and what Fluid is doing with this common liquidity layer. And on the other hand, you have protocols like Morpho and Euler that do not follow the same approach. Yes, their liquidity is much more fragmented, but when you want to borrow on Morpho, you choose the market where you want to deposit. For example, if you have CBBTC, you go on Morpho and you deposit the CBBTC and you borrow USDC, and you are exposed only to CBBTC and USDC. Or if you want to provide liquidity to a market, you can choose the market. It's a bit complicated to provide liquidity on Morpho on a specified market. You have to choose a specific front end like Monarch, but you can do it. So Morpho is much more isolated from that kind of risk. And even if they also have a shared interface, so at least a shared liquidity version through the vaults, where you can provide liquidity and it gets deployed across several different markets. That part is similar to Aave, but they also have a part that is not at all similar to Aave with more isolated markets. So for borrowing on Morpho by default, you choose the market where you want to borrow, and that is actually a good thing because it isolates you from these kinds of risks that Aave just have right now. And at the very least, you know exactly what you are doing before you borrow. And another effect on this crisis is that pool utilization rates on Aave has exploded. And that means if you had provided the liquidity, for example, USDT, if you had USDT or USDC working on Aave and generating yield, and you want to come today to withdraw them, well, it simply isn't possible. Look at it. The utilization rate is at 100%, which means all the USDT has been lent out. So yes, you are generating 13, 14% yield, maybe even it moves toward the 15% yield, but you are stuck. And that's where we end up with a lot of Aave users being blocked because everything has been borrowed out. There was a general panic. Everyone tried to withdraw their funds, and of course it didn't work. In lending and borrowing protocols, when everyone tries to pull out at the same time, there is an adjustment mechanism through dynamic interest rates. And yeah, there are situations like this where things can stay blocked for a while. So yeah, that part is complicated too. It's going to create problems for sure. This issue of unavailable liquidity is something that can happen elsewhere too. So it could happen on Morpho or other protocols. There are always risks when you deposit and lend. The money you lend can always end up being used by other users, and that risk is always there. And yes, that's part of why rates are so high right now. We're looking, like I said, at 15% to borrow USDC. And do you know who's really getting hit by all this? Well, it's the people doing loops to generate yield. You know, a lot of people are doing that on Aave. They deposit on Aave, they borrow, they redeposit, they borrow again, they redeposit again, they borrow. And when the rates explode, they get into serious trouble. And on top of that, since it's blocked, and I show you that you can't withdraw the token, people can't even unwind their position. So they're stuck in these loops with negative yield, sometimes minus 80%, minus 90%, and they're going to get liquidated very quickly if this keeps going. So yeah, that's also a huge problem for people using these kinds of loops, these kinds of leverage. I say this all the time. I do not use loops. I don't do that because it's like leverage, like in trading. I don't do leverage in trading also. So yeah, I don't consider myself good enough to use leverage in trading, and I stay away from it, and I'm really happy. And in DeFi, it's the same. I don't use leverage there either. It's just too risky. You get these black swans events from time to time, and when they happen, the impact is massive. And that's exactly why I advise against using leverage. There are safer ways to generate yield. There are safer ways to grow your crypto capital without taking that kind of risk, without spending too much time on it, and without putting yourself in a situation where one event can destroy everything. And that's the approach I prefer. So yeah, this is obviously a major blow for Kelp, for LayerZero, and all of that. But yeah, for me, the one to watch is Aave, because the reaction and the way this gets handled is going to matter a lot for the future of Aave and for user confidence in Aave. How are they going to manage this? Are they going to use their treasury? Are they going to use Umbrella, use other mechanisms, maybe even go far as selling tokens to investors to fill the hole? That's possible. And honestly, I think they need to do everything they can to make sure that users do not take losses, because otherwise trust is going to disappear little by little. If people end up losing 5% or 10% of their capital on Aave because of this, then people are going to stop saying Aave is a very secure protocol. This is the kind of thing that stays in people's memory for years. It leaves a mark. So I think they really need to find the solution. For now, we still don't know what they're going to do. My feeling is that they may prioritize Aaves on Ethereum, like I said, and leave Aave on the L2s to deal with more of the pain. That's my view, but again, we'll see. Aave cannot decide everything on its own. A lot of it, in fact, the decision is in Kelp's hand, and so Kelp has to decide how to distribute the losses among users. So that's what I want to tell you today in this special hack video. What just happened is extremely serious, and we'll see what happened over the next few days. I'll keep you updated because, there will probably be a lot of announcements in the coming days about this situation. I wish you a very good day. I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Bye-bye.